The word Jesus uses for the weeds in this parable is zizania, and it is not a generic term for any unwanted plant. It is a specific species, darnel, that in its early growth stages is virtually indistinguishable from wheat. The roots of the two are entangled from the start. Pulling one without the other is not merely difficult, it is agriculturally impossible. Jesus does not say be careful not to uproot the wheat while pulling the weeds. He says, do not pull the weeds at all. The Greek imperative is emphatic, to leave them alone. Let them grow side by side until the harvest. The servants in the parable are eager to act. They ask, do you want us to go and gather them? And the answer is a flat no. The reason given is not that the weeds are harmless, but that the timing of the separation belongs to the master alone. Yet if you look at the history of the church, the most consistent pattern is the exact opposite. From the Donatist controversy in the 4th century, to the Inquisition, to the Puritan expulsions, to the denominational fractures over every imaginable issue, the Church has repeatedly decided that it knows which plants are weeds and which are wheat. It has appointed itself the harvester before the harvest, and it has done so with a certainty that the parable itself undercuts at every level. The servants are certain they can identify the weeds. Look at their question, do you want us to go and gather them? They do not ask if they can identify them. They do not say, Master, show us how to tell the difference. They assume they can. The assumption is so deep that it does not even occur to them to question their own eyesight. And the Master does not correct their confidence by saying you might be wrong. He corrects it by saying that even if you are right, the cost of pulling is too high. The wheat will come up with the weeds. That is not a theological nuance. That is the structural argument of the entire parable. The problem is not that we cannot tell the difference between good and evil. It is that we cannot separate them without damaging the good. And the damage is not hypothetical. Every time a Christian community has tried to purify itself by expulsion, it has taken something essential with it. The 16th century reformers threw out the veneration of saints and also threw out the deep communal memory of the faithful dead. The evangelical campaigns against liberal churches in the 20th century threw out theological rigor and also threw out the compassionate pastoral care that often came with it. The impulse to pull is always fueled by a sincere desire for holiness, but the parable insists that holiness is not achieved by subtraction. It is achieved by patience and by waiting for the one who sees roots that we cannot see. The word zizania does theological work here that most readers miss. In the Septuagint and in Jewish agricultural literature, darnel was not just a nuisance, it was considered a cursed plant, something invasive that arrived by enemy action. Jesus leans into that. The enemy sows it at night deliberately. This is not accidental contamination. This is sabotage. So the evil in the field is not a metaphor for general human fallenness. It is specific, malicious, intentional. And still the command is not to pull it. The master is not naive. He knows exactly how the weeds got there. He does not minimize their threat. He simply refuses to act in the time frame the servants demand. The harvest will come. The burning will come, but not now. The zizania word carries an even deeper resonance when you realize that in Jewish apocalyptic thought, the enemy who sows bad seed is often linked to the serpent in the garden, the one who introduced corruption into creation itself. The parable is not describing a one-time mistake or a random setback. It is describing the condition of the world under the influence of a hostile power. The enemy has done his work, and the field is now mixed. And the master's refusal to respond with immediate purge is not weakness, it is a different kind of wisdom. He knows that the remedy of premature judgment produces a worse outcome than the disease of present mixture. That is the theological point that the church has consistently refused to learn. The impulse to purify now, to separate now, to judge now, is actually the strategy of the enemy because it destroys what the master is trying to preserve. This is where the cultural weight of the parable becomes physical. A first-century Galilean farmer listening to this story would have felt the tension in his hands. Darnel carries a fungus that is toxic to humans and animals. If it is left in the field, it contaminates the grain. The entire harvest could be poisoned. The servant's urgency makes perfect sense. Act now, or the wheat itself becomes dangerous. A farmer who let darnel grow risked losing an entire year of labor, and worse, risked poisoning his own family. The master's response makes no sense within that framework. Let the poison grow. Risk the entire field. The farmer would have recoiled, would have felt a visceral knot in his stomach. And that is exactly the point. Jesus is describing a kingdom that does not operate by the logic of self-preservation. The kingdom is willing to risk contamination for the sake of not losing a single stalk of wheat. The master does not calculate the risk and decide it is worth it. He does not calculate at all. He simply knows that his servants cannot do what they are asking without destroying what he values most. The present-day reader feels the same recoil. Every instinct says that when you see evil growing where good should be, you remove it. That is what discipline is. That is what church membership is. That is what holiness looks like. You see a member who holds a troubling doctrine, a leader whose character is questionable, a movement that seems to be drifting again. The first thought is to cut it out. That thought has a name. It is called the sin of certainty. The parable does not argue against discipline or holiness. It argues that the discipline and the holiness belong to the master, not to the servants. The servants are not told to tolerate evil. They are told to stop acting as if they can identify it with certainty and remove it with precision. The moment you think you can, you have already mistaken yourself for the landowner. And that is the sin the parable is actually addressing, not the presence of weeds, but the presumption of the weed pullers. The church has ignored this parable for centuries in its most literal meaning. Augustine read the parable and concluded that the field is the world, not the church. So within the church, you could and should weed out heretics. That reading has dominated Western Christianity. The problem is that it fundamentally rewrites the parable. In the story, the master says the field is the world. The church is the wheat. The church is not the field. The field is the entire creation. The wheat and the weeds grow together in the world, and the church is not given responsibility for the world's purification. It is given responsibility for being wheat, for growing, for bearing fruit, for waiting. The church's job is not to decide who is genuine and who is counterfeit. The church's job is to be genuine and to trust that the master can tell the difference at the harvest. But that requires a kind of trust that the church has never been comfortable with. It requires trusting that God's judgment is both better and more merciful than ours. It requires trusting that some weeds might become wheat. It requires trusting that the process of growth is not finished yet. The servants in the parable see the field in a single moment. The master sees the entire season, and he is not in a hurry. That is the tension that the parable leaves unresolved as it moves toward the explanation Jesus gives later in private. The explanation clarifies the meaning of the symbols, but it does not resolve the deeper problem. Why would God allow the weeds to grow? And why would he forbid us from touching them? The first answer is practical: you will uproot the wheat. But the second answer is theological and far more unsettling. It has to do with the nature of the kingdom itself, and with what kind of people the master is growing through the long, slow, agonizing process of waiting. That answer is not given in the parable. It is given only in the living. That answer is not given in the parable. It is given only in the living. And the living of the church across 2,000 years has produced a record that reads like a long refusal to accept the answer. Think of what happens when a congregation discovers that one of its members holds a view that seems dangerous, or when a denomination splits over a single issue, or when a Christian leader is publicly exposed for failure. The first instinct in every case is to pull, to separate, to draw a line and enforce it. And in almost every case, the line is drawn with confidence. And in almost every case, the line turns out to have been drawn in the wrong place. The person who was a weed in one generation becomes a saint in the next. The doctrine that was heresy in one century becomes orthodoxy in another. The church has repeatedly pulled up what it thought was a weed, only to discover that it had torn out a stalk of wheat that was still growing. This is where the Greek word for the end of the age becomes essential. Jesus uses the phrase synteleia to aeonos, not simply the end, but the consummation, the completion of the age. The word synteleia carries the sense of a project that has reached its intended goal, not a random termination. The harvest is not a disaster that ends the world. It is the moment when everything that has been growing finally arrives at what it was meant to be. The wheat reaches fullness. The weeds reach their own fullness as well and are gathered for burning. But the key is that both come to fullness together. The process of growth is not interrupted by premature judgment. The wheat is allowed to become what it is, and the weed is allowed to become what it is, and the difference between them becomes obvious only at harvest time. That is because the wheat has a head that bends under its own weight, while the weed stands upright and brittle. You cannot tell them apart when they are young and green, but when they are ripe, the wheat bows and the weed stands. The posture of maturity is a posture of humility, and it is not visible in the early stages. The deep theological argument of the Scintilla is that God trusts time. God trusts the process of growth to reveal what the servant's eyes cannot see. And this trust is not passive resignation. It is an active, patient, sustained refusal to act before the appointed moment. The master in the parable does not say let them grow because it does not matter. He says let them grow because the time for separation is not yet. That is a statement of confidence in the harvest, not indifference to the weeds. The master cares about the field. He cares about the wheat. He cares so much that he refuses to risk a single stalk by acting too soon. And the servants are called into that same care, which means they are called into that same patience. The present-day reader feels the weight of that call every time they encounter someone in the church whose faith looks different from their own. The instinct is to classify, to label, to decide whether this person is wheat or weed. And the classification is almost always based on what is visible, what doctrine they hold, what behavior they exhibit, what tribe they belong to. But the parable insists that visibility is not reliability. The weed looks like wheat. The wheat looks like weed. That is the entire point of the zizania, is a counterfeit that cannot be detected by appearance alone. So when you decide that you know who is genuine and who is counterfeit based on what you can see, you are not exercising discernment. You are exercising presumption. And the parable is not silent about what happens to presumption. It is condemned by the master's refusal to let the servants act on theirs. The word for the separation at the harvest is aphorizo, which means to mark off boundaries, to separate with a clear line. The angels will do this at the end of the age. They will gather out of the kingdom everything that causes sin and all who do evil. The verb is decisive, surgical, final, and it is reserved for the angels. The servants never receive that verb. They are never told to separate. They are told to grow. That distinction is not accidental. The parable is built on the asymmetry between the servant's role and the angel's role. The servants are the church in the present age. The angels are the church in the age to come. The church is called to be wheat, not reapers. And when the church tries to act like angels before the time, it does not become angelic. It becomes something else, something that the parable condemns without qualification. The historical weight of this condemnation is staggering. When Constantine made Christianity legal, the church immediately began using the state to suppress dissent. When the Reformation broke the Western Church, Protestants and Catholics alike used coercion to enforce doctrinal purity. When the Puritans landed in America, they established governments that punished theological deviance. In every case, the church believed it was acting righteously, protecting the field from weeds. And in every case, the church was acting directly against the command of the parable. The servants were told to leave the weeds alone. They did not. They pulled. And the wheat came up with the weeds every time whole communities of faithful believers who simply thought differently were torn out and burned in the name of purity. The parable does not say that the weeds will not be judged. It says that the servants are not the judges. This brings us to the most difficult application for the present-day reader. The church today does not burn heretics at the stake, but it does other things. It excludes, it cancels, it shames. It draws boundaries so tight that only a small circle remains inside. And it does all of this with the same certainty that the servants had, the same certainty that the Inquisition had, the same certainty that every wave of church purging has had. The certainty is the problem. The parable does not say that discernment is wrong. It says that the kind of discernment that leads to premature separation is destructive. And the only cure for that kind of certainty is the long, uncomfortable practice of waiting. Waiting for God to reveal what you cannot see. Waiting for the harvest to make visible what is now hidden. Waiting without acting as if you are the master of the field. There is a word in this passage that is almost never discussed, and it is the word siligo, which the servants use when they ask permission to gather the weeds. It means to collect, to bring together. The same verb appears in the explanation when Jesus says the angels will gather out of the kingdom everything that causes sin. The same verb. The servants want to do what the angels will do, and the master says no. The verb is not wrong. The timing is wrong. The authority is wrong. The servants are not authorized to use the verb. That is the theological argument that the church has missed. It is not that separating is evil. It is that separating before the harvest is an act of usurpation. It is taking a role that belongs to God alone. And every time the church has done it, it has acted as if it were God, judging with finality what only God can judge. So what does this mean for the person watching this script? It means that the people in your life who frustrate you, who hold views you consider dangerous, who seem to be weeds in the field of the church, you are not commanded to remove them. You are commanded to grow next to them. You are commanded to bear fruit in their presence. You are commanded to trust that the Master knows what he is doing. And you are commanded to resist the overwhelming temptation to take the Master's work into your own hands. That is not an easy thing. It is perhaps the hardest thing the gospel asks of you, because it requires you to live with unresolved tension. It requires you to admit that you do not know who is wheat and who is weed. It requires you to treat every person you meet as someone who might surprise you at the harvest. And it requires you to believe that the Master's patience is wiser than your certainty, which means the parable is not ultimately about the weeds at all. It is about the servants. It is about what happens to people who are given responsibility in a field they do not own and who must learn to wait for a harvest they do not control. The weeds are a problem, but they are not the problem the parable is solving. The problem the parable is solving is the human heart that cannot stop trying to judge what it has not been given the eyes to see. The Master's command to leave the weeds alone is a command to trust. Not trust that the weeds are harmless, they are not. Not trust that the field will be perfect before the end, it will not. But trust that the one who owns the field knows what he is doing, and that his timing is the only timing that matters. The servants who learn to wait become the wheat that bows. The servants who refuse to wait become the weeds that stand. And the difference is visible only to the one who sees the harvest coming.